This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
In the ecological thought, I coined the term hyperobjects to refer to things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. A hyperobject could be a black hole. A hyperobject could be the Lago Agrio oil field in Ecuador or the Florida Everglades. A hyperobject could be the biosphere or the solar system. A hyperobject could be the sum total of all the nuclear materials on Earth, or just the plutonium or the uranium. A hyperobject could be the very long-lasting product of direct human manufacture, such as styrofoam or plastic bags, or the sum of all the whirring machinery of capitalism. Hyperobjects, then, are hyper in relation to some other entity, whether they are directly manufactured by humans or not. Hyperobjects have numerous properties in common. They are viscous, which means that they stick to beings that are involved with them. They are non-local. In other words, any local manifestation of a hyperobject is not directly the hyperobject. They involve profoundly different temporalities than the human-scale ones we are used to. In particular, some very large hyperobjects, such as planets, have genuinely Gaussian temporality. They generate space-time vortices due to general relativity. Hyperobjects occupy a high-dimensional phase space that results in their being invisible to humans for stretches of time, and they exhibit their effects interobjectively. That is, they can be detected in a space that consists of interrelationships between aesthetic properties of objects. The hyperobject is not a function of our knowledge. It's hyper-relative to worms, lemons, and ultraviolet rays, as well as humans. Hyperobjects have already had a significant impact on human social and psychic space. Hyperobjects are directly responsible for what I call the end of the world, rendering both denialism and apocalyptic environmentalism obsolete. Hyperobjects have already ushered in a new human phase of hypocrisy, weakness, and lameness. These terms have a very specific resonance in this study, and I shall explore them in depth. Hypocrisy results from the conditions of the impossibility of a meta-language. As I shall explain, we are now freshly aware of these conditions because of the ecological emergency. Weakness from the gap between phenomenon and thing, which the hyperobject makes disturbingly visible, and lameness from the fact that all entities are fragile, as a condition of possibility for their existence, and hyperobjects make this fragility conspicuous. Hyperobjects are also changing human art and experience, the aesthetic dimension. We are now in what I call the age of asymmetry. Hyperobjects are not just collections, systems, or assemblages of other objects. They are objects in their own right, objects in a special sense that I shall elucidate as we proceed through this book. The special sense of object derives from object-oriented ontology, OOO, an emerging philosophical movement committed to a unique form of realism and non-anthropocentric thinking. Least of all, then, would it be right to say that hyperobjects are figments of the human imagination, whether we think imagination as a bundling of associations in the style of Hume, or as the possibility for synthetic judgments a priori with Kant. Hyperobjects are real whether or not someone is thinking of them. Indeed, for reasons given in this study, hyperobjects end the possibility of transcendental leaps outside physical reality. Hyperobjects force us to acknowledge the eminence of thinking to the physical. But this does not mean that we are embedded in a life world. Hyperobjects thus present philosophy with a difficult double task. The first task is to abolish the idea of the possibility of a mental language that could account for things while remaining uncontaminated by them.